Macron. Do you know Macron? He's a very nice guy.
I want France to be a startup nation.
I said, Emmanuel.
France is an old country.
Macron.
To launch your business, to become a startupper.
No, you cannot do that, Donald.
Meaning both a nation that works with and for the startups, but also a nation that thinks and moves like a startup.
I said, Emmanuel.
Artificial intelligence.
I said, Emmanuel.
New mobility, new energy.
I said, Emmanuel.
Entrepreneur is a new France.
All right, Liam, it's been about a month since we released our last episode. How's it going?
Yeah, good. Just like with summer, vacations are important to us.
Yes, well, we're French
Yes.
in that sense.
Even if we weren't actually on vacation, just on vacation from the podcast. The most stressful thing in my life, at least.
So on this episode, we're picking up our series on Minitel. And just as a reminder, on our first episode, if you haven't listened, check it out. We discussed how the French were living in the networked age almost a decade before their American counterparts, thanks to a government-led initiative dubbed Minitel. We talked about many of the differences between Minitel and our modern internet, as well as mentioning some of the critiques and or misconceptions which have been levied against Minitel.
So if you haven't listened to that, that's episode 11, Minitel Part 1, that we posted on December 2nd. You can find that on our website, royalpalacemedia.com, and definitely recommend listening to that first for some background on the basics of Minitel.
Yeah, and I hope on our first episode we were able to convince listeners that Minitel is interesting in itself, that there's seeds of like what the internet could have been, that maybe the internet wasn't so inevitable. And there's a certain, I want to say, fetishization that some in the Minitel world, just like in that of our modern internet, that can kind of take hold, in people who are interested in technology. And I certainly experienced a little of that from Minitel. But on this second part, I hope we're gonna look a bit more critically at Minitel, how it worked, its centralized nature, the mechanisms of state control which were used to regulate it, or if you want to use the American parlance, censor it. And we're also going to look at kind of the foundations of Minitel and how, in many ways, wasn't divergent from the internet, but actually very much played into the creation of the internet, or at least the internet that we know. So I want to take a step back and go to 1978. Now, in 1978, this was when President Giscard d'Estaing was looking for a way to move France forward in a world in which a lot has changed, because we're at the end of the 30 glorious years. Neoliberal logic is starting to proliferate in states, and France is dealing with the austerity that comes with the end of Bretton Woods and the Nixon shock. And in that margin he decides, as we talked about in episode 1 or in our first part of this series, he goes for projects like nuclear, like TGV, and like Minitel. And what was the basis for Minitel was the Nora Mink report. And this was a 901-page document that was produced for the president by 2 researchers. It sort of outlined a vision of a digital society. Now, reading this report, I come away very much with the impression that, oh my God, they predicted everything, right? They predicted that in the future, like, firms will be completely transformed by this digital informatic society. They predicted that traditional political power structures won't work exactly the same, that they'll be they almost predicted this kind of transnational aspect of the internet where, like, one country can ban content, but ultimately you can't stop it because of this massive networked society. Now, I'm always a little bit cautious, though, with these kinds of things where I'm like, oh my God, they predicted everything, because, there's a certain, and I think this is true with, science fiction. People always go, oh, with Star Trek, they predicted the flip phone. It's like, or did they predict the flip phone? Or did they rather inspire the flip phone? They created the flip phone, and then Nokia engineers were like, yeah, that's what we're going to do, right? Because I watched Star Trek as a kid. And I think very much when I read like reports like this, I wonder, right? Were they predicting the digitalization of society, or were they prescribing it?
Right, because, I don't know much of this history about how how much, the inventor of the modern World Wide Web, Tim Berners-Lee, was inspired by Minitel, but he was obviously aware of it. He was working at CERN in Switzerland, right on the French border. In fact, CERN spans it's technically in Switzerland, but there are parts of it that are actually in France. So I'm sure that Tim Berners-Lee was very much aware of Minitel. So right, it's like you say, France is not, despite how much sometimes French people think this, a totally separate society from the rest of the world.
Yeah, and we have to remember that, all these kind of visions of a digital society, they exist in the United States, they exist in France, and they also exist in the Soviet Union, right? There's a whole chapter on cybernetics we could talk about in the Soviet Union. Now, the Nora Mink report is very French in the sense that it said, look, digitalization of society is inevitable. So the question for France is whether or not it'll seize this opportunity or become a victim of it. This is at a crossroads, because back in the 1960s, Charles de Gaulle also saw technology as important for French society. But unlike his American counterparts, he didn't see it as much as a defense question, but more as like a future of the France. He believed that IBM can't rule the world and that French companies need their piece of the pie. So the Nora Mink report takes that and says, look, digitalization is happening. It's going to happen. They envisioned how it'll happen. They talk about how you're going to be reading the press online one day, right? You're going to be reading newspapers online, et cetera, et cetera. But they also say that France has to be a part of it. The French state needs to mobilize to make this happen. And so they prescribe the creation of informatics networks. So this would eventually be the Transpac network that, Minitel used that we talked about in part one. This would also be sponsoring French industry, creating demand in French industry to manufacture terminals and other equipment for the Minitel network. What's interesting, though, is arguably even back in the 1960s, Charles de Gaulle was too late, because yes, French companies would have a role in the digital era that most other countries don't enjoy. I mean, Alcatel, for example, one of the successes of all this state-backed innovation, they certainly have a role in our modern tech society, but ultimately, despite all the will in the world, American companies still dominate the tech sector today. Nonetheless, this kind of very much state logic would eventually lead to France having some of the most technically trained societies in the world. One of the things that comes from all this is that France saw technology as being something kind of ideological, as being part of society, as I said, instead of defense. So what they did is they always had this emphasis on getting technology into schools from the youngest ages. So like most French schools already had computers or Minitels, so not necessarily personal computers, but terminals at least, in their schools in the 1980s. That obviously was not the case in the United States, because they thought that, look, we're going to go to this battle of digital competition or whatever, and so we need to get our people trained on it. Meanwhile, in the United States, it was very much a defense logic, right? Like technology is explicitly for defense, and ARPA didn't really see it as transforming society. They thought it was going to transform the military, the war fighting. So that's kind of interesting. Now, I realize when I talk about criticisms of Minitel, many people don't realize there's criticisms of Minitel. But I think something we have to understand is that there's kind of this libertarian cyberpunk logic of the internet. Like, Liam, how much do you know about, kind of like internet ideology?
I try to avoid it. No, but I mean, I always think when I encounter this stuff that I would have gone insane if I was coming of age or a young adult in like the late 90s, turn of the century, for many reasons, but especially related to technology, because I am unlike Patrick, I'm a huge Luddite. I do not like tech, and I almost actively try not to know about it. But the good thing today, at least, is that I think the majority of people or young people are kind of anti-tech in at least a vague way, right? But it really seems like, I don't know when this ended, but probably 2008 had something to do with it. And also, the Facebook and so on turning into these monsters that everyone blamed for the election of Trump in 2016, whether that was true or not. Before that, in the early 2000s, you had this just culture of just obsession with this internet libertarianism, right? Where just everyone thought this was going to create a new kind of democracy. And I'm always annoyed when you read leftist texts from the early 2000s, it feels like there's a whole lost decade there where so many leftists were just caught up in this internet libertarian ideology of, yeah, this is going to democratize everything. Everything's going to be radically free and user generated and like Wikipedia, which I do love, by the way. I do love Wikipedia, and I would defend it against all critiques. But this has thankfully become something that almost no one believes in anymore, I feel like. Right? Even like the internet ideology of today is not that anymore. Like the tech ideology of today is not that anymore. They very much do not believe in everything being free. I mean, I guess there's still like the open source communities and these people, right? But the mainstream Silicon Valley ideology doesn't care about that anymore. In fact, they want to monetize everything. Like the Web 3.0 ideology, the crypto ideology is sort of, I mean, they might sort of take inspiration or identify themselves with that older libertarian ideology. But where that older libertarian ideology wanted everything to be free and everything user created and open source, the Web 3.0 ideology is sort of the opposite, where they want everything to be monetized, literally everything to be monetized.
One of the interesting things about the internet, as we experience it, is it's free in many ways in the sense that there's a lack of control. But that's not always the same thing as free, right? And the lack of control is that, yeah, if you want to steal movies, no one's going to stop you. It's not like walking in your Blockbuster and, where there's a decent chance where if you walk out with a movie, you might get caught and punished, right? People in the early 90s were sharing stolen software. They were stealing stolen software, and that felt liberating in a way. And they were exchanging texts that they felt were, not accepted in mainstream, you wouldn't see it in a library or whatever. And so it gave some people this kind of feeling that there's, some inherent power of the internet. But there's another aspect here, which is that technology, like one of the big things it does is it allows individuals to do tasks that normally would have required like more individuals to do, right? It would have required some sort of society, some sort of grouping of people to do. But now you can do it all on your own. So people found like creating your own software on your own felt liberatory to some people because they were like, before this would have been impossible, right? Because I would have needed to be attached to a university who would have a mainframe computer, and I would have relied on them for all the resources. But personal computing made people feel kind of almost like godlike, that they could surpass these more traditional societal restrictions that required you to talk to other people.
It's a revolution. People don't like talking to other people, that's for sure. It's revolutionized the world of being alone.
Like imagine robbing a bank. There's no way you can do it without like a team of people you trust.
Yeah.
Now, ransomware gangs are groups of people, but ultimately, like one dude could ransom a whole company.
Yeah.
Like it's feasible. So that individualization makes people feel like it's individually liberatory, but they don't see that like the culmination of all of this isn't necessarily liberatory. The ideology of very much the 90s, kind of this cyberpunk libertarian thing, is like feeling that technology itself is transformatory, and they didn't really attach much political content to it, right? They thought like just naturally it will happen. Of course, we know today that that's not really true. And honestly, it wasn't even realistic in the 90s, right? They said, well, information's free and we can do whatever. Well, the thing is, encryption wasn't generalized until kind of the late 2000s, like general internet encryption. What does that mean? It means that all your traffic was flowing in clear text over the internet and anyone could read it, right? So what protects you from the state? And the answer that these kind of cyberpunks had was, we can do encryption ourselves, we'll come up with it. And they eventually did, right? Like PGP, pretty good privacy, is a great example of it. It's like, just some guys coming up with the idea of like, protecting, keeping your stuff secret from the government. And they thought that was liberatory. But let's be real. Like if you wanted privacy from the government, what you needed was a government that agreed to respect your privacy. Mm-hmm. And that's where we've gotten to this world where we have apps like Signal and WhatsApp and honestly they're probably like in terms of encryption they're pretty good, and they're going to stop just the average person from looking at your texts as they transit over the wire. But that's not the only way to get like privacy, and maybe it's not even the ideal way to get privacy. And especially in the 80s and 90s, you had no choice but to trust somebody, and these people didn't want to trust anybody. And so the only protection we really had in the Minitel system from privacy violations, from the government spying, was just trusting that the government would do it, right? That it would respect your privacy. And what I think is really interesting is in France, I think that was I'm not saying they didn't do any. I have no idea. But I think generally most people were not concerned about the government snooping on them, right? They felt that they lived in enough of a democratic state that like there were limits imposed on that. Whereas I think when you get to the 90s with the cyberpunks, we already had lost faith in the American state as being anything but the enemy of the individual. And we see that problem today, right? Like we have some of the best encryption now. Like every time you access a website, you're using pretty good encryption over the wire. And has that stopped the NSA from spying on you? Of course not. So all these progresses that we've seen in sort of privacy and security, they don't really seem to mean a whole lot, at least in stopping your government. So that's also why that like in Europe, people are putting their hope in regaining privacy by just restricting the state's ability to violate it. Whether or not it'll work, we'll see. So the kind of commonly told story about Minitel from these kind of people, the libertarian types, is that, well, the Minitel system was controlled by the government, and therefore that's bad. It's just default bad. Even though, again, the internet was an ARPA creation, so specifically defense creation. They say that the system is super centralized and that that's inherently a bad thing, that somehow created the failure of Minitel. They also say that there was a lot of censorship. And this is where I think we still have a lot of residual internet ideology that we, like the left, the right, everyone kind of agrees with. They say censorship, their definition of censorship is always a bad one. It's kind of like how everyone uses propaganda as a slur now, whereas like properly it's not a slur, right? It's just PR. It's just another way of saying PR. And for some reason, PR doesn't have a bad rep. I don't know why. And so they levy against the Minitel system that, there's just rampant state censorship. But of course, these same people are a bit less critical about Facebook. Right? When Facebook says, oh, you can't talk about terrorism on here, everyone goes, oh, well, it's a private company, so they can regulate themselves. It's like, wait, what? Why is it okay when a democratically elected government regulates speech, for which you can, by the way, go to court if you disagree? And there's due process. Everyone who's ever dealt with Facebook knows there's no due process, at least no meaningful due process, right? Imagine someone defames you on Facebook. If they decide to remove it, they'll remove it, and if you're the poster, you can basically do nothing to get it back. And if you're the person being defamed and they choose not to do anything about it, basically nothing you can do. Anyway, so we're going to look at how whether or not any of these critiques really stand up. And we're going to look at maybe a bit more about why Minitel might have not ultimately worked out, or at least is a failure in the mind of some. So let's start with centralization. What do we mean by centralization? Centralization logically means that there's a central authority that kind of dictates everything. It doesn't mean there's not margin for like adapting to local circumstances, but it means that there's kind of a central power, whether it's state or private. In the case of Minitel, of course, it's state, that kind of creates an ecosystem that we have to live in. And anybody familiar with the French state, the history of the French state, knows it's a highly centralized state. It's always been this centralized logic, right? Lawmaking, as we talked about in an earlier episode, lawmaking only occurs at the national level. There's no local laws or no regional laws.
Yeah, very differently from the progression of the U.S., which has become steadily more centralized over time. And in the U.S. internet, you still have state laws mattering. Online gambling is legal in some states, not others, for example. But in France, since the inception of the modern French state, after the French Revolution, France has always had this centralized logic.
Yeah, and so it's inevitable that, of course, this centralized logic was applied to Minitel. So the national government said, hey, we're going to create this system. They gave it to the ministry, the PTT, the Ministry for Post, Telegram, and Telecom, and all decisions were taken at the national level. What's interesting, though, is, of course, deployment was a bit more regional, and actually the kiosk system ended up being a little bit regional. So there's always kind of, there's shades of gray on this. But ultimately, the PTT was in charge. And that logic was also reflected in the way the network worked. So the way the network worked is you had terminals, again, how you access Minitel. They were given away free by La Poste. And then you have servers, right? So these are essentially computers that are able to provide a service to people. And then in between, you have routing nodes based off the telephone network. And these were called PAVs, and these would route traffic. And now this is not very dissimilar to how the internet works today. The difference, though, and this is where there's truth to the centralization argument, is that all traffic basically had to pass through a PAV. Now, this is different than internet because, Liam, if you and I are on my Wi-Fi network, I can route a packet directly to you without talking to the PAVs. I could just route traffic. And the internet's very good at this. it can dynamically figure out the shortest route to route packets from one PC to another. And this is why it's very hard to stop the internet, right? This is why even in China, even with their firewall, even with the relative lack of bandwidth that they have to talk outside of China, tons of traffic still goes through them. This is why Tor works in Iran and Russia, right? And it's really hard to unplug yourself, because as long as there is a technical route that can be taken, a packet can be agnostically routed through the network. And that's the power of internet. This didn't work on Minitel. Now, there were ways around it. So if Liam and I wanted to have a direct connection between ourselves, right? We wanted to get around the state censorship system. I could just use the traditional phone line. So we could basically just talk over the phone line, make a direct call connection, and then, we could transmit our illegal content. But realistically, peer-to-peer communication was not possible, right? And this is why, like, peer-to-peer is why torrenting is still massive. And no one can really stop it, no matter how much the studios or some governments want to. So here, there's an argument that there was a lack of decentralization. Now, why would you want that? There's an advantage in having everything centralized, which is that it gives a lot of power to the state to organize it, so they can easily censor stuff. If ISIS.com, if you don't want ISIS.com to exist, the French state could do something about it. And by the way, today, that's also true, because domain names are quite regulated. So the US can easily get your domain pulled. Can they get your IP pulled? No, but they can try and block it by getting internet service providers to not serve it.
Yeah, and they can effectively shut you down a lot of the time, like it's just happened to LibGen.
Yeah, it was centralized, and especially at the time, they didn't see a reason to go to decentralization for one big reason, which is TCP/IP, which is the backbone of the modern internet, didn't exist yet. So, if you want to criticize it for a technology that has yet to be invented, sure, I guess.
I wanted to ask about, regarding centralization, about websites, or what did they call, the equivalent of websites?
Services. Minitel services.
Services. Okay.
And people usually just refer to them by their calling code plus the name. Okay.
So services, quote unquote, websites. Were they all maintained centrally? Like, if you were a private company with a Minitel service, was that hosted on one of the PTT's servers?
No. And this is where there's an argument that there are centralized services, and Minitel isn't one of them. Because other services, I believe the Germans, for example, did a video text system that never took off, and so did the British, by the way. But I believe the way the German system worked is, indeed, all services had to basically be like centralized, run by their version of the PTT. Whereas France, especially, and this is owing to the futuristic logic of the Nora Mink report, they believed that Minitel was the basis upon which private industry will take over. They said, we just need to build the foundations of this house, and entrepreneurs will take over, like business will take over. And so, as a result, in many ways, it worked like the modern internet. And what you had to do, though, in order to get your service up, was you needed a server. And so you could just use, Unix systems were pretty popular, especially in the later years. But, you could just use a computer. And unlike other video text systems, in terms of like what programming language you used and like what you wanted to serve was pretty much up to you. The PTT provided very detailed technical guides, because, again, they had the premier engineers on this. But they were there was not a lot of prescription as to what you could do. So if you wanted to host a server, you get a server, and then you need to get a server connection, like a phone line, basically, that is a bit more performant than just your average phone line, that could transmit more data. And you would ask the PTT to hook you up, and then if you wanted, it was optional. You could list yourself on the kiosk, and everyone loved the kiosk system, which, as we talked about in part 1, allowed people to become services to become wildly profitable, because people were charged on a per minute basis, and the government kept some of it, and the rest went to the service provider.
Right, like one of those men being, to plug another episode, Xavier Niel, owner of Le Monde, who made his fortune on Minitel sex services, or Sextel. Listen to our episode 12 about the French media to learn more about him.
Yeah, and he and many others who made their fortune off of Minitel are a great example of how, okay, maybe the system isn't as like government centralized, like, you know, non-innovative as some techno-libertarians claim, because yeah, the system was entirely made up of private service providers. I mean, the government created the phone book basically, and a couple other like government services, but ultimately, what made Minitel powerful was the private entrepreneurs who took the call to develop their services on it. And again, the PTT was pretty open to whatever you wanted to do on it. I mean, that's why we had an era of, you know, sex services. The government wasn't going to stop it. There were talks about it, but they didn't. We'll get to censorship in a bit. But on the centralization point, I've also heard the kind of Minitel system being kind of compared to Apple, right? They say, oh, it's like Apple because, you know, in Apple's walled garden, you take what you can get or what they're willing to give you, and they take 30% of everything that happens there, right? It's kind of like the App Store, right? You can't not anyone can get their own app on the App Store. You have to comply with rules, regulations, and you got to do censorship. Everyone forgets that. Every iOS app is applying censorship because if they don't, they get kicked off the platform. That's why Telegram, the guys who are like, we don't listen to even the French government when they tell us to censor terrorist content, they censored some stuff on the App Store because Apple had so much power. So some people compare Minitel to that.
And I want to say some of that Apple censorship is quite draconic. Like I always think it's ridiculous how, like the multilingual dictionary app word reference that I use, if you try to look up a swear in there, it won't give you a translation. It says look at us from the web, and that's because of their like the requirements for everything. I think like everything on the App Store to be suitable for children, theoretically at least. I'm sure there's a lot of stuff on there that's not theoretical for children, but if you want to look up how to say damn in French, you have to do that on the web. You can't do that on an app.
Awesome.
Yeah.
And so some people compare Minitel to this. They say, well, there's a centralization. Yeah, they can censor service. But there's a big difference, which is that ultimately Minitel was an open system. Again, they weren't going to tell you can't say damn on word reference. Apple's very prescriptive about how you code your apps, what APIs they use, etc. Not the case on Minitel.
Mm-hmm.
And again, unlike Apple, there's a state, so you can sue the state. You can go to court. You can every decision that they make, that the PTT made, if they were too slow hooking up your line, if they overcharged you, if they censored your content, if they didn't approve your service, you could easily go to administrative court in France, and you can't do that with Apple. And the other thing is, the 30% that Apple takes is rent. That's just pure rent that they're taking for using their walled garden. And I would argue that, Minitel maybe went that way at some point where the state kind of took on a more private logic, but arguably it was to finance the very real infrastructure it built. Because remember, France took its telephonics or telephone infrastructure from outdated to beyond anything in the world, beyond the US in the 1980s. So, I think it's somewhat reasonable to say, okay, well, maybe they're going to make some of the money back to fund infrastructure.
Right.
So that's centralization. So yes, there is more centralization, but again, the technology wasn't around for the decentralization that we know and love today under TCP/IP, and maybe there was an argument that it wasn't actually, if it had existed, wasn't necessarily the right way to go.
Yeah, and also as you're kind of saying, talking about Apple there, comparing it to Apple, the internet today is like the vast majority of it is extremely centralized. It's centralized in a few different platforms or tech universes like Alphabets, Metas, Apples, and so on. But it is still extremely centralized. Of course, people like in theory that it's not. That in theory you can visit websites that aren't part of that system. But in practice, the way that most people spend most of their time interacting with the internet is via these platforms that are very centralized, completely closed boxes. Like if you look at YouTube, the YouTube algorithm, for example, anyone who's a YouTuber will tell you that it's a complete black box to them what you have to do to get the algorithm to promote you. There's all sorts of theories, and I think it's also a black box how much YouTube's really making off your videos, like what cut of your ad revenue is YouTube taken, etc. These things are all super, super centralized, unaccountable. It's not just that we're saying that it's worse that it's a private company as opposed to the government, but it's also less accountable. You were saying the government has courts, the government has transparency. or at least there's some theoretical transparency where these private companies have zero pretension to transparency or fairness.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. You could one of the arguments you can bring up when you sue the government is that they're not treating public service users as equals. That's a legitimate argument you could bring up if, say, they weren't hooking up your Transpac server connection fast enough. You can say, hey, it's not fair that they're hooking up my neighbor way quicker because he's important or whatever. And now there's a whole, and we won't have time for on this episode to talk about it, but there were some minor corruption scandals on specifically this front, and eventually the privatization of TF1, which is a French TV channel that used to be owned by the state. And in that whole process, let's just say their connection to the Minitel network got put up a lot faster than everyone else's. But generally, right, you're dealing with a state that doesn't specifically care about like which services get online, right? Their whole goal was like, look, we have a list, we get to people when we can. And again, you could sue if you disagreed. Okay, now let's get to the fun part: censorship or content regulation, depending on how you want to look at it. So something our listeners need to know, and we talked about the French media in our last episode, but now we're going to talk about the law of the press just a little bit. So France does not have the First Amendment à l'américaine, and that means that essentially there's this idea that like we have freedom of speech, we have the right to say what we think, the freedom of consciousness, but we don't necessarily have this idea that like you can say whatever you want and everyone's feelings be damned. And arguably, the U.S. doesn't either. There's a lot of places where speech is regulated. I mean, I'll remind people in the 20th century, it was very common to basically bar a newspaper from publishing something. And so France never has this kind of absolutist, like anti-government logic of like, you can't regulate speech. Mm-hmm. And this is owing to the law of the press. And the law of the press basically says, okay, but there's some things you cannot say. Defamation, you can't insult certain public figures like meaninglessly, like you can't just say a judge is, evil for no reason, basically. You can't essentially like glorify terrorism. There are laws about what you can say. And as we talked about in the Telegram example, providers can actually be held accountable for allowing that kind of stuff to proliferate on their platforms.
For better, for worse, whether you agree or disagree. It's just a different logic.
Yeah, and so this logic is well over 100 years old. Okay, so it's alive and well in France, and everyone understands it. And one of the other things is that this speech is regulated as a criminal matter, as opposed to a civil one. And what this means is that yes, you can risk prison for really gross gross examples of glorifying terrorism or defamation. But it also means that there's a relatively short statute of limitation. So you risk criminal sanction within 3 months of saying something usually. And so that means like, if no one's going to reproach you for saying something 5 years ago. And this being criminal also means that judges actually have kind of a lot of discretion. Right, they can say like, oh, I think in this example, this kind of speech was fine, and they can sanction you by like fining you a relatively small amount, and that's what happens most of the time. Like France is generally not regulating speech to a point I think people would find shocking. Like I certainly wouldn't call it censorship. There's certainly some fringe examples, but anyway, the point is censorship exists, and it's legal and it's regulated. Mm-hmm. And honestly, we could use some of that sometimes in the U.S. I mean, think of people who write just blatantly false stories in the New York Times. I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. And there's no punishment for it, right? Even though it's knowingly spreading false information, there's practically no recourse. So in this context, Minitel was subject to a degree of regulation that or censorship that the internet wasn't. And so what did this look like? Well, one of the big things is that services started self-regulating because they were unsure exactly how the government was going to proceed with content regulation, how they were going to apply the law. So they were a bit nervous. And, some people call this chilling speech. And maybe to an extent there was. There's, for example, like some of the Minitel Rose services for our listeners. Remember, this was the sort of pornographic. I mean, not really pornographic, but like sex chat rooms or whatever. You would have staff members of many of these chat rooms essentially constantly monitoring it and being like, "Oh, you can't say that," like you've gone too far. You can't talk about having sex with minors, for example. Call that censorship, call that regulation. I don't know. It's up to you. But I mean, there are credible allegations that certain more like radical, especially in terms of sexual orientation, like focused websites were perhaps more criticized by the government than others, right? I mean, this one of the books I read for this, they talked about some of the gay services, talking about how like they kind of knew they were under a closer watch than maybe the more straight focused services. But there was ultimately all these services were allowed to exist and flourish, and arguably this was like we won't know, but American society, especially in the 1980s, was certainly a lot more socially conservative and probably still remains than a lot of French society.
Very much so.
Just the idea. I mean, you have to imagine in Paris, in many parts of the country, you would just see naked depictions of people at bus stops as ads for Minitel. So this stuff wasn't secret, and it was very much in everyone's face, including gay services. And would the U.S., would the 1980s America be so tolerant of some of the content that was allowed to proliferate on there? We can only guess, but I think it's fair to at least say that maybe the censorship critique isn't always as strong as some might choose to make it out to be.
Yeah, and I don't think the fact that the government could censor it is not an inherently bad thing. I would almost say. You can definitely say they censored it too much or in the wrong ways, but sort of almost everyone agrees that some form of internet censorship is necessary. If you disagree with that, then you end up having to say that you think it's okay that child pornography is available on the internet, or that it's okay to buy illegal substances and firearms on the internet. And to be fair, some people do say that, and I suppose props to them for consistency. But the vast majority of even free speech people could go, okay, well, yes, social media platforms should be censoring illegal content like child pornography. But then the question there is, there's always going to be a conversation to be had about what should be illegal content. And since everyone kind of agrees that some content should be illegal to disseminate on the internet, again, like child pornography, really hard to argue with that one, it follows that the government has the right to censor some things because it's dangerous, because it's harmful to society or harmful to individuals in some reason. So once we agree to that, it doesn't look so bad that the government has the ability to censor a service like Minitel. It just becomes a conversation of what should the government be censoring. And that's just a democratic conversation, right?
And interestingly, France had that democratic debate. There were lawmakers in the 1980s saying we should just ban this stuff. But surprisingly, the PTT actually held pretty strong to their guns and said, look, our goal is not to be the police of speech, right? The right in particular hated the fact that, there were chat rooms where people were discovering their sexualities, and that was not censored, at least in any meaningful way, during Minitel. At least, not in a way. I guarantee you the 80s would have looked different in the US. I'm just going to say it. Like, the lack of censorship on the US internet, I really believe, is largely because the interest in having a quote unquote free internet for US power is much more important for the government than censoring like minor stuff. You know what I mean? Like the fact that you can exchange freely on the internet is ultimately more beneficial for the US government than censoring any I don't know, scandalous content.
I mean, to respond to that, I would say, yeah, I agree. Like the fact that, the U.S. government funded the creation of Tor, for example, which is not to say that Tor has a back door, but just that the internet is so overwhelmingly like what's on the internet, the conversation on the internet is so overwhelmingly serves the American hegemony for various reasons, because of American cultural dominance, also because the internet, as I was saying before, is so controlled by the big American tech companies that it is mainly currently in the interest of the US government to have that stuff be freely available and to sort of push it on everyone else, right? Like that's why free internet in Cuba or unrestricted internet in Cuba is such a big deal for them. But I think this TikTok ban, for example, is kind of an indication where if that ever stops being the case, if tech companies say are Chinese rather than American, if any part of the global internet conversation shifts away from being overwhelmingly American and dominated and pro-American, then the attitude of the American government can change on a dime.
Now, another example of kind of at the crossroads of censorship and centralization is the system to get online, to get your server online. So initially, the PTT was really reluctant, notably owing to kind of the ideology and logic that we talked about in the 1978 report. They were reluctant to put any sort of a priori control on the services created. So it's actually the government that didn't want to regulate. However, there's a very important lobby in France that didn't like this, and it was the press. So basically, the press lobby argued in favor of content controls and notably a verification before a service can go online. And now a cynical reading would be that, well, they had a desire to preserve their monopoly over the discourse and to essentially prevent any sort of competition. And perhaps a less cynical reading would be that it was to, uphold the integrity of the press, right? How can we possibly compete with, bloggers, essentially?
Right, especially if the bloggers aren't under the same press laws that the written or TV press is.
Ultimately, it was basically decided that everyone's subject to press law, largely because the press lobby for services on Minitel. Mm-hmm. And again, very much pushed by the press lobby. And I think the correct reading is, yes, they were trying to preserve their monopoly. Absolutely. I think the idea that they were protecting the integrity of the press is maybe only a runoff, accessorial. Whether or not it actually did, whether or not, there's any value in the press that they created as a result of this, I don't know. But they wanted the government to essentially prevent too much competition from coming online. But what's really interesting is, and I think we mentioned this on the first part, is that the press survived and actually thrived because of Minitel and eventually the payment system of Minitel. But interestingly, a lot of their profits from this era were not coming from striking journalism that people were reading on Minitel. Instead, most of their profits were coming from these chat rooms that all of the different services ran. So Le Monde, for example, had a chat room that people would use to discuss literature and all types of things and sex.
Huh.
And it's wild. And Liberation, for example, beyond just Maoist content appearing in the early 1980s, there was also people organizing protests on their chat room.
So kind of proto-social media.
I would say so. But the other interesting thing, I think, is this does change the press fundamentally, right? Before, the press made money off of making articles. Now, the press is acting, I think, being pushed to act more like a corporate actor, right? They'll be like, oh, well, we can't just have articles, right? Like, we need to diversify and we need to find new channels of income. And these channels of income can be completely detached from their supposed mission, right? Like, maybe you could argue the Liberation chat room being a place for like radical thinking maybe is in line with their mission, but people trying to like meet girls and guys on the Le Monde chat room, I'm not sure is how that fits into their journalistic aspirations. And who knows, maybe this is kind of like a sign that the press would ultimately, be run in a much more corporate way, or maybe it was just always inevitable. I don't know. The interesting thing, of course, was people got married because of this, meeting on the Le Monde chat room. Which is awesome.
Embarrassing story of how you met.
Hey, people get married off of Tinder now. At least on the chat room, it was a little more organic, I think, than some algorithm telling you this person's, for you or whatever.
Man, imagine, if anyone who works at the New York Times is hearing this, they'd be kicking themselves. They could have had it so that the the internet's foremost social media was the New York Times comment section. They would love that.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I haven't thought of it exactly in that way before, but yes, the press was behind modern or the chat room, right? In France, at least.
I used to be quite active when I was a teenager in the Guardian's comment sections. I think that's kind of fallen off. I feel like comment sections kind of fell off, or like it might still exist, but it's not right there. It used to be. There was like a while when all those new websites were really pushing that, really being like, this is a conversation. This isn't just, we're kind of a social media.
There's only good stuff from those, There's all the great comments, I'm sure.
Well, they were very heavily censored, of course.
All right. So this system, though, of pre-authorization eventually went by the wayside because, frankly, it just was not practical. Just imagine, right? The PTT, it was a massive ministry, but imagine there's thousands of services coming online. I mean, this is the boom of France's Silicon Valley, which is much colder and grayer, but
rainier.
Yeah. But it is. It's a tech boom, and they just didn't have the time to deal with it all. And honestly, the press had already established itself on the internet, on Minitel. And so they eventually abandoned it in favor of a post review, like a posterior review, meaning basically there's a commission that makes sure that everything's fine. And realistically, I mean, you wouldn't imagine the kind of content that was allowed to proliferate without any real restrictions.
It's funny to think, if things had gone differently, Silicon Valley could now be, instead of in San Jose, California, it could be in, where precisely Minitel was developed, Patrick?
Somewhere in Brittany.
Their labs were in Saint-Malo.
Yeah, there you go.
In Brittany, which very, very picturesque city. It's a great tour. I've been there, actually. It's like a city that's like basically an island and is all walled. It was actually destroyed by the Americans in World War II, but they rebuilt it like exactly. But for those who don't know France very well, Brittany, in the west, a peninsula in the west of France, is notoriously the rainiest part of France, like by far. It's just very funny to think that would be France's Silicon Valley. Well, I guess San Francisco is the rainiest part of California, so maybe it kind of fits.
And also just a point I want to add about the pre-authorization system. So the person that you would ask for this permission basically would be your préfet. Now, I believe we talked about this on one of our introductory episodes, but basically a préfet or a prefect is the representative of the state in where you live. And look, the préfet is not an expert on Minitel. And realistically, it's, just someone of his, immense functionary staff that was dealing with these requests. Now, this meant a certain subjectivity, right? Where in one part of the country, maybe they would approve an application that they wouldn't approve elsewhere. But it also meant that it was mostly, or in large part, a formality where, there wasn't that much of a control being undertaken, I think, at this level. I mean, just imagine, right? You're explaining to préfets are usually pretty much around the end of their career, or at the height of their career, at least. So, they're dealing with they're in charge of the security of their area, all types of administrative stuff. And then, some guy says, hey, we're approving some service or whatever on this telephone thing, right? There's only so much vigilance you're going to do. And
right. Probably most of them still don't know how to use email. So you can just imagine in the 80s.
I didn't have this in my notes, but I'm glad you mentioned that, because one of the interesting things about Minitel is how usable it is, right? Compared to the personal computer. Again, these are dumb terminals. They're not computers. And so they were just dead simple. It was hard to do it wrong. It was hard to Minitel wrong. And that's why everyone adopted it. But that's also why just many old people, like many elderly people, were still, over 500,000 people were still using Minitel when it was shut down in 2012. So that's, 20 years after the commercial internet just dominated, right?
Right.
These people were like, no, but I'm so used to Minitel. It's so easy to use. This computer thing, it's expensive. There's just so many things to deal with, like all these viruses and things that just pop up, just wasn't a thing on Minitel. And, they loved it. Unbelievably. I mean, just imagine being in 2012 looking up a phone number on a terminal from the 80s.
Right. I assume the average age of people doing that was in their 80s themselves.
Yeah, and that's why a lot of public service, well, there's a few reasons. A lot of public services remained on Minitel through the 90s. even early 2000s, like a lot of the post Minitel case law is about whether or not the government needs to bother putting things on the internet. Because for a while, like for example, your test results from school, for example, or whether or not you get into a university or signing up for university, all this kind of stuff was done on Minitel well through the 90s, even the early 2000s in some cases. And so eventually the question was posed to the courts, is it okay that you can only sign up for university or this exam or whatever, or you only find out the results of this exam on Minitel? And eventually the courts were like, okay, look, you cannot just put something on a system no one uses anymore. You have got to also expand that to the internet. Because there were people who were like, I couldn't sign up because I don't have a Minitel for this job, you know?
Yeah, based on my experience signing up for classes at university in France, I wish they had let me do it any other way, including Minitel. I'd rather I have to like I'd rather have to send a postcard to sign up for classes. That system was so bad.
And this is the story of France, right? France came into the Minitel era with just an aging telephone system that had been long forgotten and well behind the rest of the world. They revolutionized their world, at least. They revolutionized France with Minitel, but they struggled to switch to the internet age. And so that meant a lot of our systems that honestly we used, Liam, at university were likely developed originally under Minitel and were poorly transplanted to the internet age.
Yeah.
And that's the thing. The state came in and it revolutionized and then it abandoned it. And so the 90s were very much that. It was like we have this system of Minitel coexisting with the internet and no one seemed to have an incentive. I mean, what stopped the PTT from adopting TCP/IP and the World Wide Web suite when it came out in '89? Absolutely nothing. It was a decision, and largely it was a decision of we're in a context where the government essentially realized Minitel makes a good amount of money. Let's focus on doing what we know how to do well. There was kind of this lack of thinking about how to keep it evolving, but also there was this creeping privatization logic. You had the PTT that was just kind of overwhelmed with figuring out how to charge people, and people getting mad because they're getting charged a lot for uses they claim that they didn't do. Like, I mean, there's amazing court cases where they're like, John says he didn't do it, but everyone says they couldn't ever get him off at Minitel. So yeah, he probably did spend 2,000 francs on Minitel. Everyone at work says he's always sneaking on Minitel during lunch or whatever. Like there's actual court cases about that. Because some people would rack up like more than their salary in Minitel bills at work. But they completely dropped the ball. I mean, in the 90s, they had this idea of like expanding Minitel. By bringing it as a private product to the United States, for example. So in San Francisco, they created 101 Online, and it was like CompuServe or any other video text system in the U.S. It didn't take off, and it lacked the essential things that made Minitel work in France. Free terminals? No, you had to buy them. Not free service, but you pay per usage, and it's all backed by the state infrastructure. They didn't do any of that, right? They tried to adopt a completely private logic and try and sell it as a private company, and of course that didn't work, right? It's like, imagine if France tried to export TGV as a private commercial operator in a country that doesn't already have the infrastructure.
Well, they did try that in California.
And it didn't work.
I think if this podcast ever starts making money, we should use it to buy some Minitel terminals.
Absolutely. They're real cheap, too.
Yeah, there's because I remember I looked this up, and they were like 25 euros, just 30 euros, because I guess there's just millions of these things floating around. They have no use anymore.
Except for Minitelists. And I plan on doing this. Maybe this will be part of part 3. We can do like kind of an audio walkthrough of this or something. I don't know. We'll figure it out. But basically what people do is they create, they use a Raspberry Pi to basically create the server side implementation of Minitel so that you can kind of have the experience of using it. One thing I want to add now that I mentioned that is the weird thing about Minitel is, again, storage was not part of these terminals, not by default. So if you wanted to store anything, the main way was printing it. But eventually people would get, peripheries, or they would hook it up to their personal computers, which became, much more common in the 90s. That means a lot of these no one has a recollection of some of these things, and you have to, like, in order to recreate some of these Minitel services, you just got to talk to people and see what they remember about it. And there's an active group of people on GitHub who have done that, so you can actually kind of like use recreations of some of these services. There's also one other thing I want to add that I think's kind of interesting. We talked about censorship earlier, and a point I wanted to make about that was that, there's this kind of weird thing about internet ideology where like people wouldn't apply. Like, people who all have the same opinion about how things should work on the internet, that it should be free and absolutely no regulation, blah, blah, blah. Drugs should be sold. Those same people, you look at how their opinions in other parts of life don't seem to align at all. You know what I mean? So it's like this kind of weird void of like, when we're talking about the internet, it's like free speech. But like when it's just like about, I don't know, what you can say in school or in private spaces, it's like completely different. You know what I mean? It's this weird, like, technology kind of blurs people's vision sometimes. And I think that's very true with the internet. It's where you find like these far right-wing libertarians who find themselves, sharing the same political opinions as like radical leftists. It's a very weird distortion field that can kind of happen.
Yeah, I do think it's interesting. I do think we should do a whole episode about free speech, kind of comparing how it's conceived in France versus the U.S., because it's a very interesting topic, and I think it's something that isn't talked about enough in an interesting way. It's something that really needs to be a societal discussion on. I increasingly see people on Twitter, for example, or X, sorry, the past few days, with TikTok's ban impending. I don't know if you heard about this, but lots and lots of people have moved to. There's another app, Chinese-made app called Red Note that is on the American App Store. And so a lot of people have been moving to that. And the interesting thing about it, and it's very similar to TikTok, but it's not really, even though it's on the US App Store, it's not really localized for the US, as from what I've seen from all the videos and screenshots of it I've seen, at least, it doesn't even appear to be in English. But I guess everyone just, the buttons are very obvious. So, and unlike, TikTok doesn't operate in China. There's I forget what the name is, but there's a localized version. But this Red Note is, there is only one version.
Interesting.
So it's suddenly all these American TikTokers are interacting with actual Chinese people, which seems like a great thing. But it is, because it operates in China, heavily censors certain topics.
Sure. Yeah.
As is the case of all these social media platforms in China. And I've seen a lot of people on Twitter defending that and saying, censorship about topics about the Uyghurs, for example, or Tiananmen Square. Saying, for example, with Tiananmen Square, the U.S. has done just as bad things against its own citizens as Tiananmen Square, which I think is true. However, I do think this is sort of a worrying thing that people are. I can see why people would come around to that view, where they're like, the U.S. view is so hypocritical and wrong. But to then say, okay, the Chinese thing of just like sort of heavy-handed censorship of people talking about certain topics is therefore good, that seems to be also quite misguided and kind of a worrying tendency. Although on the other hand, I have to say, being on X since Elon Musk bought it has making me increasingly less pro free speech online because I see just so regularly like complete literal Nazi tweets. People with like the Hitler profile picture that have hundreds of thousands of followers and are tweeting these things that have hundreds of thousands of likes about how all Jews should be killed. Like, you see that now. You didn't used to see that on Twitter because that used to be banned immediately. And I used to think, well, I think people have these opinions, and it doesn't make a super big difference whether you get banned for saying it from Twitter or not. But now I've changed that view because I'm seeing it seems like it's really bad that this stuff is just so incredibly present.
Yeah.
Online. It seems like that kind of stuff shouldn't be that easily accessible because it does affect people, and it creates an atmosphere that is incredibly toxic.
Yeah, I'm wary about making policy recommendations, because there's so many factors, and I think my vague attempt at a policy recommendation here kind of supposes a state that people can believe in and trust. So I agree that, even in France, there's a debate on that. But I do think the correct outcome, just in the question of speech, is that the speech should be regulated according to very democratic principles that are established by a democratic government that is meaningfully democratic. I can't insist that enough.
Yeah.
And they should be there should be an institution that deals with that, and
which is
that tells Facebook this is illegal, and if there's a problem, like if people disagree, it's the institution they go to. I don't think Facebook should have any control over what people say on its platform. Yeah. I just don't. I think that should be a decision for the people to make.
I agree. I mean, there's a whole other conversation to have about that, so let's not go into it too much more now. But I want to be clear that I think people confuse free speech about what you're allowed to say in certain spaces versus what is legal to say. I don't think it should be illegal to say, illegal to deny the Holocaust, in the sense that I don't think you should be locked up for saying something just as a private individual. You can face actual heavy fines for that kind of thing in some European countries, including Germany and France. And I feel like that's where I'm as free speech absolutist is. You should be able to say anything. Doesn't mean that, you should be able to publish anything in a public platform.
Yeah, I do think private speech you say between people, unless it's against them, right? Like, I think I don't.
Yes.
So I think let me be clear. The way Germany does it, I disagree with for so many reasons. I think Germany, one of their big problems, I mean, besides, I think just on the face of it, some of their laws are unideal, but I think it's largely an institutional issue there, right? Like the way they have organized their administration to deal with speech regulation. But beyond that, like, yeah, I mean, I don't know, if you go up to someone on the street and go after them for their race or sex or insulting them or wishing them harm, that should probably be regulated, and it is in France, at least in theory, right? I mean, obviously,
it is in the U.S. too. There are still free speech carve-outs about deliberately harassing someone like that, or the classic "you can't yell fire in a crowded room" consequence-free type thing, creating panic. But anyway, the point is that the issue is much less absolute than Americans make it out to be.
Yeah, well, it's kind of like the Second Amendment. People just like, you can't have a debate about it. You can't have a debate about guns. Mm-hmm. If you do, people just read the text of the Second Amendment, ignoring the militia part, obviously. But whatever.
Yeah. Well,
Minitel, great.
Minitel.
Yeah, so Minitel's cool. If we ever get a Patreon, we'll use it. The first thing we will buy, after paying all the expenses we've run up from running this podcast, the first thing we will buy is at least 1 to 10 Minitel terminals.
Pretty cool to have 10.
And I will get a Raspberry Pi to run the server-side implementation. How about that?
Yeah. If you subscribe to a really high level of our Patreon, we will buy you a Minitel, send it to you, and hook it up to ours, and we'll be able to chat. Instead of a Discord, we will run a simulation of a Le Monde chat room on Minitel, and we'll all be chatting in that.
So for the 4 listeners that made it this far, thank you. We really appreciate it. But also maybe we should give some updates about the podcast. So originally we kind of had this idea of doing a weekly thing. We realized that on average we publish like maybe every 2 weeks in best of times. So I think we're going to try and do a bi-weekly schedule. Do you agree with that, Liam?
Yes. Bi-weekly meaning every 2 weeks, not twice a week.
That's right.
Get your hopes up. Yeah, that's what we're going to aim for now. I think maybe at some point in the future, as our listenership hopefully grows, we could look at trying to actually stick to a once weekly schedule. But I think just as we've decided it's a better use of our efforts now to try to make higher quality, more researched episodes and slightly less frequently.
Yeah, and in case it's not obvious from the way we've been doing it, but we essentially publish numbered episodes. And these numbered episodes are supposed to be like always relevant. Like you should be able to listen to them 10 years from now, and maybe we'll make a couple references to contemporary, whatever's going on in the world. But ultimately, they should last in time. It's specials where their validity is probably like a week to a year, depending on the topic we're covering. And that's because we want to deal with contemporary topics, but also have like a backlog that has interesting topics that'll always be interesting.
Which is something no other podcast does, but we can all assume that they're wrong and we're right.
Yes, based on our overwhelming success.
Yes. All right. Thanks for listening, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
See you next time.
Cheers.
La France est une chose, à mes yeux, très considérable. Je me fais en effet de la France une certaine idée. Je veux dire par là qu'à mon sens, elle est quelque chose de très grand. Je me fais en effet de la France une certaine idée. extraordinaire.
Je ne fais pas partie de la France une certaine idée. C'est relativement raisonnable.
Il faut que la France joue son rôle, c'est exact. Et pour qu'elle joue son rôle, il faut qu'elle soit la France.